Hello, this is a video covering ATP and metabolism, in other words, how energy is produced. ATP is the primary form of energy used in cells, and is very important for life since many proteins need ATP to do their job. You can think of it as the energy currency of the cell. ATP is exchanged for energy that is needed for the proteins to do their job. How exactly does ATP produce energy? To answer that, we'll need to look at the structure of ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. You might recognize this part as adenine, which is one of the nucleic acids that helps build DNA. This part is ribose, which is a 5-carbon sugar. Together, they make adenosine. However, the important part here is the triphosphate portion of the molecule. We have 3 phosphate groups here. For reasons I won't go into, the phosphate group over here would actually really like to leave this molecule and become an independent phosphate group. Because of this, breaking the bond between the phosphate group and the rest of the molecule is a reaction that releases a lot of energy. During this process, the ATP is broken down into ADP and a phosphate group, with the D standing for diphosphate since it now only has 2 phosphate groups. Energy is released, and some of this energy is released as heat, which is why increased metabolism is usually associated with increased heat production. There are 2 main methods for producing ATP. The first involves the breakdown of glucose and is called glycolysis. It takes place in the cytoplasm. It also does not require oxygen, which makes it an example of anaerobic metabolism, with anaerobic literally meaning without air. As would be expected, the input is glucose, which I've drawn a simplified version of here. To start the process of glycolysis, ATP actually needs to be used first, with 2 reactions requiring 1 ATP each. Eventually, the glucose molecule gets broken in half. Since glucose is a 6-carbon molecule, each of these halves has 3 carbons. Both halves continue on with glycolysis and are eventually converted into pyruvate. 2 ATPs are produced from each as a byproduct, giving 4 ATPs total from 1 glucose molecule. Since 2 ATPs were used at the beginning, there is a net profit of 2 ATPs. While the number itself isn't very important, as you can see, this isn't all that efficient, so there's another method that produces much more ATP. The second method is called the Krebs cycle or TCA cycle. It takes place in the mitochondria. Unlike glycolysis, it requires oxygen to keep going. When there is enough oxygen, the pyruvate that was made during glycolysis is taken to the mitochondria, where it is converted into another molecule to enter the TCA cycle. During this process, a few things are produced, including carbon dioxide. It also produces what we can call energy equivalents. These are molecules that contain a lot of energy, but the body can't use it in those forms. It's kind of like using currency from another country here. It has value, it just needs to be exchanged before it can be used. This is where oxygen becomes important. Through a process called oxidative phosphorylation, these energy equivalents get their energy converted into ATP. Ultimately, this produces over 30 ATP. And again, the number isn't very important, but notice that this is a lot more than is produced by glycolysis alone. Lipids can also go through the Krebs cycle, and so can proteins. Lipids that get broken down into fatty acids generate a lot more energy compared to carbohydrates and proteins because when it is broken down, before entering the Krebs cycle, it already makes a lot of energy equivalents. That's why fats contain so many more calories, which are just units of energy. Some specific amino acids can be broken down to produce ATP, but the body would prefer to use these amino acids to make proteins, so this is really more of a last resort. What happens if the oxygen levels are low, but a lot of energy is still needed, like during exercise? In this case, pyruvate does not go into the mitochondria. Instead, it gets converted into lactate. Eventually, when there is oxygen again, the lactate can be converted back to pyruvate, and the pyruvate can enter the Krebs cycle again. If you're interested in learning more and looking it up, this is called the Cori cycle. That's it for this video. Now you know how ATP produces energy and how our body generates ATP. In the next video, we will go over some of what cells do in general, such as cell division, and put that in the context of a super cool type of cell called stem cells.